It's the morning of April 20th, 2009. We're at the Eagleton Institute on the New Brunswick campus of Rutgers University. We are here for the Rutgers program on the governor. This morning we're going to talk to Richard McGlynn. Rich was a lawyer in government practice, a public defender, an assistant prosecutor. In the 1970s, he was in Brendan Burns' cabinet as a public utilities commissioner. He ran for governor in 1981 in the Republican primary against Tom Kean and a number of others, and we're going to hear about his associations with several governors this morning. Rich, how'd you get involved in public life in New Jersey?
Well, Michael, my dad was a lawyer in Kearny, New Jersey, Hudson County, over at the western end of Hudson County. And he was active in Republican politics. He ran for the Congress against Pete Rodino back in 1954, I think it was. And my interest in politics was virtually inherited from him. And as a result, running for governor was always something that I thought about doing, believe it or not, even from that age.
From what age?
I must have, 1954, I was born in 38, so do the math.
16.
I was young.
No kidding, you thought about running for governor at age 16?
Even then, being governor was something that I was fascinated. New Jersey politics always fascinated me. My dad took me down to Trenton when I was about that age, maybe a little bit older, still in high school, and I met Governor Driscoll. I was fascinated by Driscoll. He was a very attractive, very handsome man, very well-spoken. My dad, oddly enough, at that point, was angling to get work from the what was essentially the old rate council system in public utilities work, whereby a lawyer from the public was appointed to represent the people's interest in rate cases. And my dad did a fair amount of that work, so it's somewhat ironic that I wound up being a public utilities commissioner. But yeah, I thought about political life in New Jersey. I majored in politics at Princeton, wrote my thesis on constitutional revision in New Jersey back in the late 40s when Frank Hague was still running Jersey City. So I had an interest in New Jersey politics from way back.
Besides Driscoll, any politicians that you remember from your youth?
Well, Bob Miner was a close friend of my dad's. They had both gone to Lafayette College, although not at the same time. And Miner was governor when I was at Princeton. And my dad had introduced me to Governor Miner. I still remember one reunion weekend at Princeton. A good friend and I were walking along, I can't remember the name of the street that runs into Nassau Street. Oh, it's 202, the extension of 202, Bayard Lane. And we
206.
That's it, 206. And we heard bagpipes and didn't know where they were coming from. I'd always been fascinated by bagpipes, more on that later, because Kearny was a strong Scots-Irish town, and they had at least 2 pipe bands and maybe more. And we heard these bagpipes went through some backyards, over some fences, into a building that we'd not been in before. It looked like a big mansion. And in the central hallway of that building, which we later learned was Morven, were Bob Miner and Helen Miner, and the members of the class of 1922, relatively few of whom were left, standing in a circle, listening to a bagpiper. And I stood next to Governor Miner when the piper stopped. I said, "Hello, Governor, I'm Rich McGlynn, Bill McGlynn's son." So Miner was someone who I'd met then as a young man, a boy really, still in college.
Tell us a little more about your father and your family.
My dad was a Kearny native. He went to law school after coming out of World War II. He went to the old John Marshall Law School at Knights in Jersey City, and he was the personal secretary to a judge in Hudson County named Zigner, Judge August Zigner, and knew the Hudson County courthouse We never talked extensively about that, my dad and I. I wish I'd known more about Hudson County back in those days. I think it was a place that's still curious from a political point of view. And my dad got interested in Republican politics way back when. And as I say, ran against Peter Rodino back in 1954. In Kearney, in the house that we lived in, we were living across the street from Congressman Fred Hartley. And Fred Hartley was the congressman from that old 10th district. And he was the congressman, of course, who gave the Taft-Hartley Act its name. And he was a friend of my dad's. So
A Republican?
A Republican, yes, he was a Republican. Pete Rodino won that seat, I think, in 1948, if I'm correct, maybe 1950. And the district was shifting. It was a large district back in those days that took in Kearney and Hudson County and then went over to Belleville and the North Ward of Newark, Nutley, and there was a strong Italian-American contingent in that area that wanted representation, and Pete Rodino became the congressman and of course was there forever, presided over the Nixon impeachment hearings.
When did your family come to the United States?
That's a good question. We haven't done extensive genealogical work, but as best I know, they came to the U.S. from Ireland in the middle of the 19th century, probably as part of the great emigration during the potato famine. They came to Newark, and my uncle, Edward R. McGlynn, he was not actually an uncle. My dad was a cousin to him, first cousin once removed. Became a lawyer back in 1910 or thereabouts, and became a very prominent lawyer in Newark. And my uncle, Edward R. McGlynn, for whom my brother is named, saw a young man named Joe Weintraub in his office, or at least came to know him, and saw that he had a talent for the law and financed his going to Cornell Law School. The firm then became McGlynn, Weintraub, Stein, and Ebriel in Newark, and my dad and a whole raft of people who eventually became very prominent in the New Jersey legal community were trained in that law firm. Ed McGlynn was a legendary lawyer. He was a bit of a wild man. He, I think, gave my father comfort in being one of the great ball breakers of the Western world, and my dad was similar. Edward R. would go to a dinner, and there was a judge named Rainier Wartendike in the federal system who was a great New Jerseyan from way back when, took great delight in talking about his family coming ashore back in colonial days in Monmouth County. And my Uncle Ed at these dinners would have no qualms about speaking more than sotto voce and saying, when is this guy going to shut up? So he was a very outspoken man. I remember going to a Yale Law School dinner. E.R. had gone to Yale Law School, graduated in '09, and my dad was invited by E.R. to come to a Yale Law School dinner at the Nassau Inn in Princeton when I was an undergraduate, so I was invited to come along. The dean of the Yale Law School got up and said, you know, it's terrible that our young lawyers are leaving the Northeast and they're going to Colorado because they're offering these outstanding salaries in Colorado for young lawyers. They're going to Denver. And E.R., who at that point had just about finished a bottle of Johnny Walker Black and was into at least his second or third cigar, shouted out, "Let him go." He's just such a classic man. And it was through the connection with E.R. that I first met Brendan Byrne. Brendan says that I met him, or that he met me when I was still a teenager, or maybe even a bit younger. Brendan and Joe Weintraub and Ed McGlynn would all go to the Essex County Bar Dinner in New York, which was a big event. It used to be held at the Astor. and they'd come and pick up my dad, who would go with them, in Kearney. And Brendan says he met me back then. I don't remember that, but I do remember going.
Today they would meet in New Jersey, not in New York, isn't that so?
Well, they kept that bar dinner going for a long time in New York, and it was back in those days, and for many years it was a men-only organization. We had a group of lawyers called the Bonton Repertory Company, who used to put on a show every year at this dinner, which my dad and I became a part of back when I was practicing with my dad. And it was a parody show where they would put the judges up, sing parody songs. It was great fun. But in I think it was 1959, when I was still at Princeton, Brendan had been named acting prosecutor by Bob Miner. He had been Miner's personal assistant. And they had a big dinner for my uncle's 50th anniversary at the bar, somewhere in Newark. I think it was, I think it was the Essex House, but I'm not sure. Maybe Robert Treat. And I still remember meeting Brendan at that point. He was a very young, extremely well-spoken, obviously very bright person who was having trouble getting confirmed for the prosecutorship because Miner had pushed Brendan on Dennis Carey, who was then the Democratic chairman. I think it was Dennis Carey back in those days. But Brendan eventually got confirmed. But I remember meeting Brendan at that dinner and obviously being attracted to him as a person. And then after I graduated from Princeton, I went to Rutgers Law School in Newark. And those were back in the days when we still had to serve a 9-month clerkship before we could be fully admitted to the bar. And between second and third year, that would have been 62, Brendan got permission from Joe Weintraub, who was then Chief Justice of New Jersey, to have a clerkship program in his office that we would get clerkship credit for. And he hired me and 3 other guys to be a summer intern, in effect, in the prosecutor's office. And we had a great time, had a wonderful time.
I want to ask you a little more about that, but first let me go back. How many siblings did you have?
2. I have a younger sister and a still younger brother. My brother is 8 years younger than I am. For a long time, he was my brother. Then when he was Tom Kane's chief of staff, I was his brother. And now we're I think we're pretty much equal.
How about your mother? What did she do?
She didn't work outside the home. She and my dad met when my dad was an undergraduate at Lafayette. They met in theater, interestingly enough. My dad would perform in theater productions at Lafayette, and they needed women to take parts. And so some young women from the town would come onto the campus to act, and the 2 of them met that way. And the interest in theater is something that we passed on even to our own children.
Miner was a Democrat.
Miner was a Democrat.
You say your father went down to talk to Miner
about... No, to talk to Driscoll.
Oh, to talk to Driscoll.
And Driscoll was a Republican, the first governor under the modern Constitution.
Who were the Republican bosses when your father ran for Congress?
Oh, good question, Michael. I honestly don't remember. I don't remember. I do remember that my dad was trying to take advantage of Eisenhower's coattails. Eisenhower had been elected in '52. '54 may have been the election where Cliff Case went to the Senate for the first time. I'm not sure. I don't remember that. But my dad was trying to run on Eisenhower's coattails, and they rented a trailer that they dragged around on a car to be the sort of McGlynn for Congress logo, banner, whatever, with a big photograph of my dad with Ike, shaking hands with Ike on the side. I don't remember how badly he lost, but I know he lost. Pete Rodino was beginning, if not fairly well, entrenched in that seat at the time.
What were the ethnic politics in that district at that time? Your father was
My dad,
Irish,
yeah.
and Rodina was Italian,
Yeah.
and Weintraub was Jewish, and
Well,
Byrne was Irish,
and Catholic.
and Catholic.
You know, this is the old mantra about you're Irish, you're Catholic, and you're a Democrat. I could only qualify on one of those three things.
You weren't Catholic.
No, we were. My dad's father.
Were you Irish or Scottish?
Well, it's interesting both, but the name is an Irish name, Michael. Yeah. All I remember about that campaign is my dad was trying to attract Italian American votes. The fellow who ran his campaign was a fellow named G. George Addonizio. And G. George Addonizio was a Republican. Hugh Addonizio, I think, was a distant relative, and of course Hugh Addonizio was a Democrat congressman at the time. He and Rodino, I think, went to the Congress at about the same time. And I know my dad campaigned in Nutley, and that he sought and got the support of somebody named Frank Orecchio. And Frank Orecchio was a long time commissioner of the Water Authority up in northern New Jersey, and built a very comfortable empire for himself in that position.
Passaic Valley Sewerage Commission?
No, Passaic Valley Water Commission, I think it is. Is it Passaic Valley? I think so, yeah. Yeah, I think so too. You're going back, scratching very deeply, Michael.
We do that.
Yes, I've noticed.
Don in particular. Brendan Byrne attracted you to the prosecutor's office in this clerkship experiment that he got permission from Weintraub to do.
Yes.
You and three others.
Yes.
What was he like, Brendan Byrne, in those days?
He was virtually unchanged from the way he is now, in that he had a wonderful sense of humor. We did not have much contact with him, but anecdotally, I remember at the end of the summer, the four of us took him to lunch at a restaurant called Zig's, I think it was, in Orange, just over the line from Newark. And while we were sitting at lunch, Brendan looked up, and someone had come into the restaurant, and he nodded to acknowledge this person. And the person went by, and Brendan said something like, "My father always told me that if somebody looks you squarely in the eye, that you should make believe you know him." And I've thought over the years, that was probably the extent of Brendan Byrne's political skills at the time. I'm probably wrong about that, but I still remember that quite vividly.
Were you fond of Byrne?
Oh, it was impossible not to be fond of the man. He was, in addition to having a wonderful affability, he was incredibly bright. And I still am amazed at his ability to see things in the society, see things in the law that those of us who were working with him simply didn't see. And he was very insightful. Excuse me for...
Sure. Who were the other assistant prosecutors?
Well, I became an assistant prosecutor after graduating from law school. We did this summer thing. The other three were John Graham, who was a law school classmate at Rutgers, who eventually became a law partner, Don Weitzman, and Mike Griffinger, who is now a very prominent lawyer.
John Graham, who raised a lot of money in presidential races?
No. This John Graham became, he went on the faculty at Rutgers. I think he still has the highest grade point average out of Rutgers Law School of anybody who ever graduated. I think he became an assistant dean at Rutgers. As I say, he was a law partner. Did a lot of public utilities work when the Rate Counsel office was established under Byrne. No, maybe earlier than that. And went to General Public Utilities as an executive and became treasurer, I think, at GPU. So he was a public utilities guy and a good guy. But after I graduated from Rutgers Law School, I was an associate at McCarter in English, and I finished the rest of that 9-month clerkship period. McCarter in English then had 9 partners. It now is the largest law firm in New Jersey, and I've lost count of how many partners it is. It's in the hundreds, I think it is. But it was a great firm. I really enjoyed my time there. And one day I got a call, and this voice, "Hey, Richie McGlynn, how are you?" "Fine. Prosecutor, how are you?" He said, "Brendan said, they've been sending me people from downtown, and I'm not happy. I want to put some of my own people in the prosecutor's office. Are you interested?" And I immediately said yes, or virtually immediately said yes, and then became an assistant prosecutor, which was then a part-time job. My dad moved his law practice to Newark, and he and I became partners. So we set up our own law firm in Newark, and
Called?
McGlynn and McGlynn, and I became an assistant prosecutor under Brendan, and was there from '65 until '68. More fun, hard work, great lawyers. Every Friday morning, a staff meeting. I had to be there at 9 o'clock, and this was back when the courts wouldn't start till 9:30. And Brendan would conduct this staff meeting. If you were late, he'd make a note of it, so there was a real sense of you've got to be on time. And we'd talk over what's been going on, cases that are being tried, recent appellate cases that might have some impact on us. And Brendan always kept a shoeshine kit in his lower right-hand drawer. And about halfway through the staff meeting, he'd open the drawer, put his shoes up, start to shine his shoes, and we'd all be talking. It was, it's classic Byrne. Just always interesting, always fascinating.
What did you work on in that job?
I did both appellate work and trial work. It was probably the second best job at the law that I ever had.
What was the first best?
Being a judge, and Brendan appointed me to the bench. I prosecuted a couple of black Muslims in separate trials who had robbed the Robert Treat Savings and Loan up on Clinton Avenue in Newark, during the course of which a police lieutenant had been shot in the back and paralyzed from the waist down. Hugh Adenizio was then mayor of Newark, and he and his driver happened to be coming onto Clinton Avenue when this robbery ended, and saw these guys running out of the bank and spreading in a lot of different directions. The word had gone out, the cops were on their way. Huey's driver put what he called the siren on, and they gave chase and saw some of these guys going into houses and trying to hide. So Huey was a witness in these cases, and I remember going down to interview him in City Hall in Newark, and remember that when I went in to interview him, he had his own lawyer in the room. And it took me a while to understand why Hugh wanted to have his lawyer there, because it was just a few years after that the Essex Prosecutor's Office turned over to the United States Attorney information that it had been developing, and that resulted in Adenizio being indicted and tried.
And convicted.
And convicted. And these, fortunately, the bank robbers were convicted. So that was probably the most prominent case that I tried. And then they established the Public Defender's Office. Governor Hughes established the Public Defender's Office for full-time public defenders. I had been asked by Len Ronco, who eventually became a judge, is now retired, who came out of the Byrne Prosecutor's Office, to run the Essex Public Defender's Office, to become his first assistant deputy. We always managed to find a way to have these titles. So I was the first assistant deputy public defender for a while in Essex.
Why did you leave the prosecutor's office and become a public defender?
Well, I was always enamored with the English system, whereby one lawyer could be both appointed Queen's Counsel and prosecute cases, and then find himself defending a criminal case. And I really enjoyed the criminal law. And when Len Ronco asked me to do that, I thought I'd been in the prosecutor's office for 3 years. It was pretty clear that Brendan wasn't going to be around forever. And of course, he eventually left and became a Public Utilities Commissioner. He was chairman of the Public Utilities Commission shortly after I left the prosecutor's office. So I became a public defender and was only there for a short time, and got asked to go up to Passaic County to prosecute the Kavanaugh and DeFranco murder cases as its special deputy attorney general with a fellow named Jim Dowd, who was a wonderful guy and unfortunately is gone. So we handled those cases. They blew up in our hands. We had the main witness who had identified the criminal defendants in the case, the murder case, the DeFranco murder case, who had been put in a cell in Passaic County and been treated as if he were royal by the prosecutor's detectives. And one night, Jim Dowd interviewed him closely about whether he was telling the truth. The defense attorneys were insisting that this was total fabrication on this guy's part. And the guy admitted to Jim Dowd that he had lied, that he had gotten educated by the prosecutor's detectives as to what had happened or what they thought had happened, and he made up his own story. And the next morning we came to work after having gone to see a judge that night, saying that we'd determined that this fellow had lied, and that the judge said, make your application. And the next morning we came to work in Patterson. Jim Dowd and I did, and found out that the prosecutor's detectives had gone back in to see this witness. They'd learned that he had flip-flopped, and he was now back saying no, that what he told us was a lie. So we had to leave, we had to resign. Lee Bailey, who was one of the defense attorneys, wrote a rather famous letter to all of the legislature and the justices, and Bailey was eventually disbarred in New Jersey, in effect. He was not allowed to try any more cases in New Jersey by the Weintraub court, who had also received copies of this rather fiery letter about the fact that his clients were becoming the victims of justice. And I wound up as the last witness for the defense when the case was ultimately tried, which is not a pleasant thing to do for a former prosecutor.
You were in the prosecutor's office in 1967 when the Newark riots erupted. What's your memory of that experience?
Michael, I'm embarrassed to tell you that I was in Bermuda at the time. My wife's family had a home in Bermuda, and we were allowed during the summers to take 4 weeks off. And I was in Bermuda at the time the riots broke out. I called the office and said, should I come home? And was told, don't bother. Stay where you are, come back when you're planning to come back. And then prosecuted a number of people in the riots prosecutions. And it was shortly after that, I guess it was 68, that I left the office and became a public defender.
You prosecuted rioters, or you prosecuted police? Or?
Some rioters,
okay.
Some rioters, yeah. I find it fascinating, and again, this is an aside, that they now talk about the Newark riots as a civil insurrection rather than the riots. And it always reminds me of that wonderful line in The Odd Couple when Jack Lemmon feeds Walter Matthau a plate of pasta, and Matthau says, I don't like spaghetti, and Lemmon says to him, that's not spaghetti, it's linguine. And he picks up the plate and throws it against the wall and says, now it's garbage. So it all depends on what you call things.
Okay, you were in the public defender's office until when?
Very short time, because I then got this position up in Passaic County.
Right.
And that, as I say, blew up in our hands fairly quickly. So I was back to private practice, and that was, I guess, late 60s.
With your father?
With my dad. And happened to run into a guy named Evan Jahos, a good lawyer, Monmouth County, another Princetonian. Brendan was a Princetonian, as you know, I went to Princeton. And Jahos became the first director of the Division of Criminal Justice under George Kugler, the AG.
In the Cahill administration.
In the Cahill administration. So he hired J-House hired me, with Kugler's approval, to be the first chief of the trial section of the Division of Criminal Justice. And I prosecuted organized crime and official corruption cases for a couple of years. One anecdote that I wanted to share with you about the Byrne years in the prosecutor's office. And I'm having trouble finding people to corroborate this. I've talked with Barry Evanchik about it. Barry's writing Brendan's biography. Barry was another law school classmate. I saw no signs of political interference in that office at all, until at one point we were being asked as assistant prosecutors to contribute to the Essex County Democratic Party. And we found a statute in the criminal code, which I don't think had ever been enforced, that said that any employee, any government employee who serves a non-fixed term is prohibited from making political contributions. And there was some pressure put on by the first assistant prosecutor to just simply say, don't worry about this. And I remember one staff meeting, and this is the only time I ever saw any political impact on the office. Friday morning, we all went into the usual Friday morning staff meeting, and Brendan wasn't there. The first assistant prosecutor was there. And he said something like, I understand there's a question being raised by some of you about whether you are fixed term or not employees of Essex County. I just want to let you know that it is the prosecutor's view that since he has a fixed term, you all have fixed terms as well. And he said somewhat flippantly, I don't know why this is a question, but that's the answer, and that's the end of the staff meeting. So we all went on our way. And a number of us did not contribute to the party. And
well, you were a Republican. Why would you be contributing to the Essex County Democratic Party?
That was exactly my position, Michael, but I was also an assistant prosecutor and a county employee. I've always been, I guess, Brendan Byrne's bastard Republican, or Republican bastard, whatever. But it's been a wonderful relationship.
You went to the Division of Criminal Justice when it was created.
Yes.
And we have 21 county prosecutors. We had them before. Why did we need a state division of criminal justice?
We needed a statewide grand jury in order to deal with organized crime, official corruption more effectively than it had been dealt with. And that was set up. Plus, the Division of Criminal Justice was given the authority to supersede prosecutors when necessary or when appropriate. And in fact, the office did exercise that power in the early 70s when Bob Dilts was prosecutor of Bergen County. He was removed from office and eventually indicted for a criminal conspiracy to adversely affect the process of justice in a particular case. I tried the case. There was a co-defendant who was convicted. Dilts was acquitted. I tried it with a guy who worked with me in the AG's office named George Schneider. George Schneider eventually became Essex prosecutor, which was a job I would have liked to have had there been a Republican governor, but it didn't happen.
How long were you in the division?
About 3 years, and then came back to private practice. Brendan had been elected governor, and in '74, Jerry English called. Actually, Jimmy Giuliano, who was the assignment judge of Essex County, wonderful guy, close friend of my dad's, called and said, I've just recommended you for the bench to Alec Waugh, who was a judge who was doing bench scouting for Brendan. He said, your father's not going to be very happy, but I think you'd be a good judge.
Why would your father not be happy?
Because I was his law partner and he wouldn't want me to leave, which was actually quite true. But my dad took that very well. So I went on the bench. In '74, I was appointed to the district court, which was then the court of lesser civil jurisdiction. We still had hadn't integrated completely the courts, and was almost immediately assigned to the county and superior court to try criminal cases. And that was a lot of fun.
In Essex County?
In Essex County.
Did you have to interview with the governor before you got that appointment?
No, I didn't. I honestly don't remember now that I had any discussions with Brendan about coming on the bench. Jerry English was handling that for...
She was counsel?
She was counsel to the governor at that time. Yeah,
Legislative
one
counsel.
of the counsels. But she was involved in helping flesh out the bench when they needed judicial appointments, as I remember. And I sat for a while. The political process. I had, when I was Public Utilities Commissioner. No, this was something else. I'm sorry, I'm confusing something in my own
Well, let me
mind.
stop you there and go
Yeah.
back a year or two. Brendan Byrne ran for governor in 1973.
Yep.
You were a state official. You were a lawyer.
I was then. I
in
just.
law
I was
and
just
public
a.
safety.
No, well, I'd left the AG's office, I think, by that time. And just another anecdote, Michael. Brendan, as you probably know, he resigned his judgeship on day one. He was then assignment judge of Morris County. And day two, he went to Trenton to deliver his resignation to Governor Cahill and declared his candidacy for governor of New Jersey, and was immediately announced as being the candidate of the Hudson County line, or would get the line in Hudson County. And there was a ban, there still is a ban, on judges engaging in political activity. And I've never asked Brendan whether, in fact, he might have had some of those discussions with the Hudson County people before he actually submitted his resignation. But it's just always been a matter of some curiosity.
Well, we have one of those Hudson County people coming later today.
Jimmy Dugan?
Yeah.
Yeah. But I was out of government by the time he declared, and I always considered it a huge disappointment that Bill Cahill was beaten by Charlie Sandman in a primary. That was an enormous mistake on the Republican Party's part. It virtually guaranteed that Brendan would be elected governor because Sandman was not a strong candidate statewide. I think I had heard a story once that Bill Cahill had said, I'm going to spend the first year of my governorship ignoring politics completely. The second year I'll spend some time with the county chairman, and then gradually I'll get myself in a position where I can get reelected. Well, he couldn't. He never could get back that political support. And the right in the party beat him down because he had espoused an income tax, which of course was eventually passed under Brendan, which I think was the right thing to do. But it was a great shame for the Republican Party that Bill Cahill wasn't renominated, because Byrne-Cahill would have been an interesting race.
Well, what did you do that year? You say you weren't enthusiastic about Sandman, but did you support Sandman as a...
I was never active up to that point, up to the point when I ran in '81. I was not that active in local Republican politics or even statewide Republican politics. My dad was, but I wasn't.
And you had worked for Brendan Byrne. Were you enthusiastic about his candidacy? Or?
Of course, but even as a registered Republican, I think I probably voted for Sandman. I honestly don't remember, but I probably did. I've voted for a lot of people who've not been terribly good candidates over a long period of time.
You're a party man first.
I am a party man, Michael, yes.
What was the reaction in Cahill's Attorney General's office to the scandals affecting McCrane and...
Paul Sherwin.
Yeah, Paul Sherwin.
Sad time. Sad time. It cost George Kugler, who I think was a fine man, genuinely fine man, and a good Attorney General, It cost him a seat on the Supreme Court. It probably cost Van Jehos a judgeship, and he would have been an excellent judge. It was a really sad time. And Sherwin, again, I don't have a strong recollection of all of what it was that Sherwin was eventually charged with. But it was a sad story that he got charged, some political shenanigans, I can't remember what it was, and was convicted. And that hurt Cahill badly. And it led, ultimately, to Burns being elected as the man who couldn't be bought. Coming out of Essex County, there was a snippet of tape, you I'm sure all know about this, that had been picked up on a wiretap where some mobster was saying, we can't get to this guy, he can't be bought. And that became Brendan's mantra in the general election. So obviously I was pleased that Brendan won the election because I think he was a great governor, and I believe that he would be.
You served 2 years on the bench.
A little bit under 2 years.
And you say it was the best legal job you've ever had.
I dealt primarily with juries. I was dealing primarily with criminal cases, dealing with a defense bar, most of whom I knew, who I had a good relationship with. Saw my job as a judge as being the person who had to make sure that the lawyers didn't get out of control on either side of a case, and that the jury kept its eye on the ball. And I had a wonderful time doing it. I really loved the work. Didn't prosecute any hugely important public interest cases that I can, or didn't prosecute, didn't preside over. That's very careful. That's a Freudian slip. I didn't preside over any tremendously important public interest cases that I can recall. Started presiding over some wiretap cases, so those were the early days of getting wiretap prosecutions going. And I had done wiretap work and argued some wiretap cases when I was in criminal justice. But I had a wonderful time. And one morning, I had a jury in the box and a case going on. Got a pass-through behind me in my bench where my secretary could pass through a message. And I see the red light go on the bench that says something's coming. And I turn around and open the door. It was one of these double traps, little door in the back. And there's a message saying the governor's on the telephone. So I said to the jury, would you all stay where you are for a couple of minutes? It's not time for a recess. I've got to take a phone call, so please just stay where you are. Get back into my chambers and pick up the phone. And again, I hear, Richie McGlynn, hey, how you doing? And I said, Governor, how are you? He said, when you were with your law firm, did you do any of that public utilities work? Because my dad and John Graham, who was then a law partner, had done a fair amount of rate counsel work. I said, no, I didn't. He said, well, you'll learn. He said, I never did any of it either, and I learned how to be a public utility commissioner. I need a Republican to go on the Public Utilities Commission. Are you interested? So I said, let me think about it and call you back. And I talked to my dad and talked to my wife, obviously, and decided to leave the bench. Brendan had said, if it doesn't work out, I'll put you back on the bench. So I said, okay, I'll do it. It was a good move, turns out.
How so?
I did it for 4 years. I went on the commission with Joel Jacobson. Joel Jacobson was Brendan's, he was very active in the labor movement. He was very active with the United Auto Workers. And the reason why there had been a vacancy is because Stuart Pollock, who is now a retired Supreme Court Justice, had been a commissioner. And Stuart wanted to go back into private practice, wanted to go back into private life. Not for long, however, because he then became Brendan's counsel and was then appointed to the Supreme Court. So I went on the Public Utilities Commission as a wet behind the ears, still relatively young man, lawyer, former judge, and Joel was a labor leader, strong Burns supporter, and a really interesting guy to work with in that he had learned utility regulation, just as I was trying to learn it. And the two of us, Joe was a strong labor supporter. I was a classic Republican and more of someone who was concerned that we needed to keep the utilities healthy because they were the state's economic lifeblood. Without electricity, without water, without gas, without telecommunication, you got big trouble. So Joel and I clashed for a while. And then Brendan appointed George Barber to the commission. George Barber had been a legislator who had been very active in the fight to get the income tax passed. So we then had a full complement of public utilities commissioners. And I learned public utilities law, and that really set the rest of my career. Because when I left the Public Utilities Commission in 1980, I joined a law firm. They understood that I was going to mount a campaign which would gain the Republican nomination for governor in 1981. Obviously that failed, and I became a public utilities lawyer. And I was a public utilities lawyer, primarily practicing in that field from 81 to 95, when I was asked to be general counsel of United Water, which was a public utility. And then I retired from United Water in 2000. Again, Brendan Byrne probably had more influence on my career than any person in my life, other than maybe my dad, who insisted that I go to law school.
From your vantage point, how did that income tax fight look? 3 years worth of struggle to get an income tax passed.
Well, to go back to Cahill, when Cahill it was clear, first he appointed Pete Garvin to be Chief Justice, and Garvin got very ill and eventually died relatively quickly. He reached out to make Hughes, Richard Hughes, Chief Justice of New Jersey. And Hughes had been, I think, a great governor. And he became a very active and incredibly smart and politically savvy Chief Justice. So in the income tax fight, Chief Justice Hughes and the Supreme Court ordered the schools closed in the summer, when the schools are normally closed, and put pressure on the administration and on the legislature to find a source for funding a thorough and efficient education that would be other than what was now being provided. And as a result, the income tax got passed.
You credit the court more than the governor?
No, it's certainly equal. But Brendan's, the court, I think, was what eventually broke the back and brought about the income tax. That's my view, Michael. I don't know whether that's accurate or not.
What's your recollection of how the public felt about Byrne after that?
Well, the 76, was it 73, 77 campaign was against Ray Bateman. And I still remember being in the Robert Treat Hotel at a debate between Brendan and Ray Bateman. And Bateman had commissioned Bill Simon to come up with a plan for running state government without an income tax. And Brendan held up the plan at this debate and ridiculed it. Now, I've asked Brendan about this. He denies that he called it the BS plan, the Bateman-Simon plan, BS plan, at that debate. I thought he had. But that's what he did, and very effectively won that election. Of course, it was a contested primary, and then came the end of his second term, and a bunch of the cabinet people, and I was in the cabinet, even though a Republican, as a public utilities commissioner, were starting to think about running for governor. And in 1980, I remember at a cabinet meeting, Brendan said, "Everybody wants to run for governor." He said, "I guess I made it look too easy." And John Degnan was running. I think Ann Klein was running. I was interested in running. And Brendan said to the cabinet, "If you're going to run for governor, I want you to resign, because I don't want you to be trying to seek public office from within the administration when you're holding a state position. So I was the first of those cabinet officers to resign, and I declared my candidacy in December of 1980.
This is a good moment for us to take a little break, and
Good. We
when
okay
come,
on time?
We're fine.
What else do you want to talk about?
Just want to mention, yeah.
Okay. Before we get to your run for governor, let's talk about your service on the Public Utilities Commission. What were the issues? What did you deal with?
Well, primarily with rate cases. Those were back in the days when the utilities were, because of the increase in the price of gasoline and of oil, and New Jersey largely dependent on oil generation. The utilities were struggling with trying to keep up with increases in costs. So there were, at one point, somebody described them as revolving door rate cases, where you'd no sooner finish one, where you'd start another one. So there was a constant tension in trying to respond to the utilities' cost increases and at the same time keep rates under reasonable control. The most interesting issue that I can remember dealing with at the PUC, however, after trying to bring a judge's point of view to utility regulation, which was interesting because utility regulation always, the PUC commissions always reserved, I guess I would call it a reservoir of arbitrariness. There was, unfortunately, not enough predictability to the process. And I was trying to bring some predictability to the process. This caused some friction. We also were dealing with the Open Public Meetings Act. That had recently been passed, I think early in the Byrne administration. Byron Baer up in Bergen County had supported very strongly the Open Public Meetings Act. And this was a huge frustration for me because I saw the PUC as being like a three-judge court. And judges in a court like the appellate division are never required to deliberate in public. We were required to deliberate in public, and this was, to me, frustrating and troublesome. But that's an aside. We had to live with the law as it was and did our best. I think the most interesting thing that happened to me on the PUC was late in my tenure there, Brendan decided to establish a Department of Energy. Their first plan had been to combine banking and insurance and public utilities and I think another agency into one super regulatory agency. Bill Hyland was AG, as I remember, spoke in favor of that. It went nowhere with the legislature. Too many jobs lost, I think. But Brendan decided to create a Department of Energy and named Joel Jacobson to the commissionership of the Department of Energy. And the PUC was put, that is the BPU, whatever you want to call it, Public Utilities Commission, was put in but not of the Department of Energy. And we had a staff meeting early on. Brendan had named George Barber, the third commissioner, to be the president of the PUC, which was a governor's appointment. I was still a commissioner. And at that staff meeting, Joel Jacobson, commissioner of the Department of Energy, announced that he was going to be making all the personnel decisions for the Public Utilities Commission. And I remember sitting with him at a table in front of the senior staff and turning to him and saying, "No, you're not." And he said, "Yes, I am." And I said, "No, you're not. You don't have the authority to do that." And he said, "Well, the governor wants me to do that." I said, "I don't care what the governor wants you to do. This agency is in but not of the Department of Energy, which means that you have no control over this agency. It's still an independent agency. It's been an independent agency since Woodrow Wilson created it, and that's not going to change." Well, he said, "Hey, that may be your view, but I'm going to make those decisions." And George Barber said nothing. So I then went back to my office and wrote a lengthy letter to the governor, Brendan, saying something's about to happen to the PUC that is untoward. I urge you to step in and immediately advised Commissioner Jacobson that he has no authority over the PUC's actions, personnel, or whatever. I'm still waiting for an answer to that letter, but that's okay, because it got referred to the Attorney General. And I think it was when John Degnan was AG, and there was an AG's opinion saying that the PUC is in but not of, and therefore not subject to the direction of the Commissioner of the Department of Energy. So I preserved the independence of the PUC, which I think is critical for it to function properly. And one of my gripes about the PUC is that it's too political. It needs to be less political, even though it's part of the governor's administration. The PUC commissioners are appointed for fixed 6-year terms, and they serve coterminously. That is, what's the right word? They don't all expire at the same time. And the governor has the ability to appoint commissioners. They're bipartisan in nature. I always thought the PUC was the closest thing to the judiciary outside of the judicial branch, and that it ought to be independent and it ought to look independent. I always thought the governor was better protected by his ability, her ability to say, I have no control over the PUC, than trying to exercise control and running the risk that the governor gets blamed for rate increases or whatever. But that's an aside. But that, to me, was the most crucial thing that I did as a PUC commissioner. And it was shortly after that that I resigned and declared my candidacy for governor. I thought, look here, Brendan Byrne got to be elected governor as a former judge, a former prosecutor, a former public utilities commissioner. I ought to be able to parlay some of that into the Republican nomination. I also thought that Tom Kean could not get himself elected governor because I thought he didn't have the public persona for it. But it turns out if you divide 1,799 by 2 and add 1, that's by how many votes I was wrong.
Before we get into that campaign, do you recall when the PUC became the BPU and why?
Oh, golly. I think it was the BPU when I went on it, and I don't remember why.
Okay.
Brendan will often refer to the PUC or the BPU, whatever it is we call it. So I can't remember when it changed.
Were
Michael.
you its president?
No. I was simply a commissioner. And because I was a Republican appointed by a Democratic administration, I had no reasonable expectation of ever being named president of the commission.
Okay.
But I was a member of the governor's cabinet, and I thought that might help in a campaign for governor. So be it.
Who were the leading utilities in the state back then?
PSE&G certainly was the preeminent, and still is the preeminent electric utility. While I was on the commission, the 3 Mile Island disaster took place, and we held hearings, and that of course was JCP&L and part of GPU, General Public Utilities. That was another significant thing we did. You're helping me remember all this stuff. And that was hold hearings after the TMI disaster as to whether we ought to allow a public utility to go into bankruptcy and what the impact of that would be. And by that time, Ed Hines had been appointed to the commission, so we were at full strength. George Barber was the president, and Eddie and I were the other 2 commissioners. Ed was a Democrat. And we held those hearings, brought in some very high-powered witnesses from the investment community and from the Securities Administration in Washington. Wonderful, brilliant man named Aron Levy came up and spoke to us. And the consensus was that it would be a huge mistake to allow a public utility to go into bankruptcy because it would turn the control of the utility over to a court and to a court-appointed entity and who knows how that would respond to regulation, et cetera, that there were huge risks in that. So the commission decided to not allow JCP&L to go into bankruptcy, but rather to keep it going, and worked diligently to bring other financial support in and some rate relief, put restrictions on their ability to issue dividends, which I didn't think was legally proper, but it was done anyway. And as you know, JCP&L survived all of that and did quite well after that. So that was another significant development. And Brendan was governor at the time. And I still remember getting a call from Mike Fedorko, who was Brendan's assistant and his driver, a great big burly state trooper who is now on the Casino Control Commission, saying there's a meeting tomorrow, Saturday, of the governor's cabinet. I said, on what, Mike? He said, I think it's on TMI. And you know, Brendan was off. He'd brought in some professor from Princeton, von Hippel, who was an expert on nuclear issues, and we were going to have to worry about issuing iodine to the state citizens of New Jersey, citizens of the state of New Jersey, in order to avoid possible radiation poisoning. I mean, Brendan was incredibly far-sighted, always thinking about what could be done to deal effectively with whatever he was facing. So that was something else that happened, I guess, when I was on the PUC that was exciting.
And the key water and gas companies?
Hackensack Water, Elizabethtown Water, run by the Kane family. Elizabethtown Gas Company, which was run by another branch of the Kane family, John Kane, who was Tom and Robert Kane's first cousin. South Jersey Gas was a fairly strong company. Atlantic Electric was an interesting company. A fellow named John Feehan was the chair at Atlantic Electric. And they were, I used to call them the feisty electric company. They would take the commission on in a more forthright way than the others. The others were very good at politicking, if you will, the commission. Atlantic Electric was, I thought, much more straightforward, somewhat confrontational, but always done with a sense of, we think this is the right thing to do. And interestingly enough, in 1986, after I had obviously lost the campaign for governor well after that and was practicing public utilities law in New Jersey, I was asked to join the Atlantic Electric board. And I've been a board member of that company and then succeeding companies right up until the middle of May of this year, when I have to retire at the age of 70. So as you can see, public utility stuff became very much a part of my life after that interesting campaign for governor.
Which we want to get to.
Good.
You have 20 minutes.
Who were the key personalities in the utility industry in those days?
Bob Smith was the president of Public Service Electric and Gas Company, and he certainly was a very strong figure. A guy named Shepard Bartnoff was the president of Jersey Central Power and Light Company. He was a former nuclear physicist and a very interesting, quirky kind of guy. I used to do a Shepard Bartnoff impersonation, which I won't bore you with now. The Kane family, certainly, with their water and gas interests. A guy named Bill Gemmel ran South Jersey Gas Company, was a wonderful guy, interesting, bright man. John Feehan. And of course, in the telephone company, you had people like Bob Kleinert, who was president of New Jersey Bell, Bill Kirchner, who was government relations at New Jersey Bell. They were very strong people in the industry, in the utility industry.
Do you recall there being criticism at the time that the utilities were too close to the commissioners?
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
They went to parties together, that the commissioners were given tickets to events by the utilities and so on.
Yeah, I do.
Was it fair or not?
It was fair, and now that the statute of limitations is run, I can say that to some extent we benefited from that as commissioners. But I think I had a strong ethical sense as a commissioner, and I would try as best I could to reciprocate whatever was done by, if we were invited to a breakfast, for example, somewhere, or invited to a dinner somewhere, I would try to reciprocate, even in as small a way as I could, by inviting the person who had invited me to come and have dinner at my expense, or come and have, and we would not obviously have the same kind of fancy dinner, but I honestly think that it's important for PUC commissioners to find ways to learn about these industries in a way that doesn't compromise their integrity. And the best way to learn about the industries is to spend time with the people that run them and to go and visit them. And we were in a cooling tower out at the TMI site before TMI-2 was put into operation. We went into a coal mine in outside of Johnstown, Pennsylvania, to see how coal was mined at one of these mine mouth utility plants, where it was literally mined and taken out of the ground and put in the power station on site. They'd built the power station on site. So to learn about the industry, it was important for us to spend time with the executives and with the people who worked in the companies, because that's the way you learn the business. And I thought it was particularly important that we understand how these businesses work. So, yes, there was a conference at Seaview every year that was attended by commissioners and staff and utilities people. And yes, I suspect we gave the public the impression that we were too close. But I never had any sense that people were caving in to the utilities because of whatever they were doing with us by way of asking us to have a dinner if we were at a utilities convention or whatever. But times have changed, and it's probably now important that that perception not be made, not be publicly available. So the distance is probably good, but it's important that commissioners know how the business works in order for them to properly regulate it.
Was your experience on the PUC the first time you really became aware of the Kane family's, the extent of the Kane family's influence in New Jersey business?
No. Tom Kane had been a friend for quite some time. Tom, as an assemblyman, attended my swearing in as a judge back in 1974. The day his daughter Alexandra was born, as a matter of fact. So I had known Tom for quite some time. When I say no, that's probably too strong, but it was as a Public Utilities Commissioner that I really came to know more the extent to which the Kane family was involved in the utility industry in New Jersey. But Tom had been a friend, an acquaintance, I think is probably more accurate. This was back before I went on the bench. I got invited, or went to, an Essex County Republican dinner, and Tom had arranged for Elliot Richardson to come and speak at that dinner. And he invited me to come back to his house where Elliot was staying after that dinner. And I spent a whole evening with Elliot Richardson, who I think was an incredibly effective public servant. Massachusetts, he had clerked for Felix Frankfurter on the United States Supreme Court so he could speak about Frankfurter in a very personal way. Frankfurter was a great justice on the Supreme Court. And I still remember very well sitting at Elliot Richardson's feet listening to him tell stories about Frankfurter, and telling stories about Frankfurter, telling stories about Holmes, who Frankfurter had worked for. And that was a remarkable night. I remember as well when I was getting ready to run for governor. I think I was still on the commission at the time. I took a day or so off and went down to Washington to visit with Elliot Richardson. He had written a book at that point called A Delicate Balance, which I thought was a really sophisticated look at how government works. And he was in a law firm at the time, and I made an appointment to go down and see him. And he was very kind. He had obviously done some research on me before I arrived, because he called me judge when we met for the first time. And I told him that I was interested in considering a run for governor as a Republican, and wondered if he would be willing to support that. And he said, "I've been a very close friend of the Kane family for a long time, and I don't think I could do that." So this is beginning to talk about this campaign for governor. I don't know whether you want to go to that now, and anything more on the PUC, I'd be glad to talk about.
We just want to hear whether you were surprised by the outcome of the '77 election, Brendan Byrne.
Beating Ray Bateman?
Beating Ray Bateman, yeah.
I wasn't surprised. I thought Brendan revealed more about his political skills in that campaign than he had ever done before. And if you remember the night that he won the election, he came on television and quoted Churchill by saying, "Rumors of my death are greatly exaggerated." That was a brilliant campaign. And I wasn't involved in either side of those campaigns at all. I was still on the PUC at the time and was not involved. But I was not terribly surprised. Ray Bateman's a great guy, and I think would have been a good governor. But Brendan really out-campaigned him. And he also deserved to win that election. When you look at the record of the Byrne years, in my judgment, what Brendan Byrne accomplished as governor, no governor before or since has ever done. When you look at his impact on the state of New Jersey, the income tax to begin with, the casino control gambling, allowing casinos to come into Atlantic City. And I still remember a cabinet meeting. I was, again, a fly on the wall, but was there. And Brendan said, "I gotta go down to Atlantic City. I'm gonna sign the Casino Control Commission bill. What should I say?" And I remember speaking up and saying to him, "Governor, you got elected on the basis of someone not being able to be bought. I think the thing everybody's worried about with Atlantic City and the casinos is organized crime. And you're in a position to make clear that you're going to do whatever you can to stop organized crime from coming to Atlantic City." Now, I don't take credit for this at all, but if you remember, when he signed that bill sitting on the boardwalk, there was a camera behind him, and he got up, as I recall, and turned around, and he shook his finger in the camera, and he said, "And I want to tell the organized crime, you are not coming to Atlantic City. We're going to do whatever we can to keep you." That's right. Keep your dirty hands off Atlantic City. Very effective.
Famous line.
Famous line. Great line.
Did you know in 1977 that you would be running for governor 4 years later?
No, I didn't.
When did that notion form?
My dad, who had so much influence on my life, at one point called and said, "You ought to think about running for governor." And of course, as I told you earlier, it was something I always wanted to do. And I thought maybe the Republican Party is ready for a candidate who comes not from the political community, but from government background and experience. Brendan had done that himself. Bill Bradley had done it for the United States Senate. He had never run for anything. You know, Bill Bradley's major claim to fame was a good quick-release jump shot and a very good career at Princeton. So I thought maybe the Republican Party's ready for a candidate who doesn't come out of politics and the Republican establishment. And I knew Tom was going to run. And of course, Pat Kramer had been around picking up endorsements, quiet endorsements from the business community and from a number of county chairmen as mayor of Patterson. So I thought, okay, maybe I can do this, and maybe we'll take a shot at it. Brendan had done two things as governor, and this was interesting because it was mentioned in the Kane colloquium just the other day. He had signed a law opening the primary, meaning that the county chairman could no longer dictate who went on the line as the top candidate in their party. It was going to be done at random drawings out of boxes. And that was a huge benefit to someone who was not political establishment. The other thing he'd done was establish public funding. So if you raised $50,000 of money in chunks of no more, as I remember it, than $800 from any one individual or entity, you qualified for public funding, and there was 2-for-1 public funding available once you got over $50,000. So New Jersey in '81 became, just as one of the two states in the country that was holding gubernatorial elections, became a camp for political junkies. They all came to New Jersey. They all got jobs in campaigns. There were 13 candidates on the Democratic side. There were 8 candidates on the Republican side. I asked Tom before, I think this was probably after I had declared, no, it was before. I asked Tom to meet me in a morning at the Short Hills Club, where we both were members. We were living in Short Hills at the time. Tom lived in Livingston. And he came to the meeting, and I said, I'm seriously thinking about running for governor. And I think you ran in the '77 primary, you're probably thinking the same thing. I think I can be an effective candidate for governor for the party, and if you will support me, I will support you for the United States Senate. I think you're an incredibly effective legislator. You've always been an effective legislator. My experience has been in the judiciary, somewhat in the executive branch. I've never been a legislator, but I think I know the governor's office, and I think I know something about how to do it. So would you consider that?
What do you say?
I don't remember what he said, Michael, other than he didn't say yes. So we went to the Republican convention in Detroit, the national convention, where Ronald Reagan was nominated. Reagan designated George W. Bush H.W. Bush as his vice presidential candidate. And all the candidates for the governorship in New Jersey, Republican, were at that gathering.
For an election 14 months away.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Well, no, for a primary, yes, but for a primary, that was about a year, a little bit less than a year away.
Okay.
That's right, that's right. And that's the tradition in New Jersey. The candidates go to the Republican National Convention and then try to win delegates. So we did that. Tom Kane was working for public television at the time, and he went as an interviewer. So he was there, but had this veneer of being an objective commentator. So
he was also getting shown back home, and you were not.
Exactly, and I was not. Other than they did cover. I guess just to go quickly to the gubernatorial campaign, we did develop a real camaraderie among those 8 candidates. And something you probably don't know because you came to New Jersey just after that campaign. In the midst of the campaign, or at least as things were heating up, New Jersey Public Television decided they were going to cover 3 of who they decided were the major candidates. My candidacy, I was not one of those. So
You filed a lawsuit.
I did.
A famous lawsuit.
Is it famous?
Yes, it is. At least in my world it is.
Good.
We're going to stop for a second and change tapes, and then we'll hear that story.
All right. Thank you, Michael.
All right.
Thanks.
So all the candidates were at the Republican convention in Detroit, I guess, or
Yes.
San Francisco?
No, it was Detroit.
Detroit in
Yeah.
1980. That would be Tom Kean, Pat Kramer. Bo Sullivan threw a big party there.
He sure did. That
You-
was Bo's coming out party.
He was a businessman from Passaic County?
No,
Essex County?
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
Beaumont Industries, I think.
Beaumont Industries. Do you recall who the other candidates were?
Yes, I do. Rather well. Let's see. Jim Walwork, Barry Parker, Jack Rafferty, Tony Imperiali, and I.
That's quite a field.
It was
That's
quite a
some
field.
big personalities in there.
There
that
were
field.
very big personalities, particularly Imperiali. And we used to go around for candidate appearances. And if Tom Kean didn't show up, and there were often times when Tom Kean didn't show up for whatever reasons, we would go in alphabetical order. And since Tony Imperiali started with I and Kean wasn't there, J.K., L.M. McGlynn got to go next. And to follow Tony Imperiali, I think as Don Rickles once said, is like following the Bear Act on the Ed Sullivan Show. It was tough.
Let's talk about the public television situation that you raised before we changed tapes. Tell that story.
Well, this is well into the campaign, and New Jersey Public Television decided that they were going to, for the balance of their coverage up to the June primary, focus on the campaigns, since there were so many of us on both sides, of the 3, what they called the top candidates. And I got furious about this, as you can well imagine, because I wasn't one of the 3 top candidates. And we decided to bring a suit against public television and allege that they had an obligation as a publicly funded entity to cover all of the campaigns. They could not, on their own, simply decide who the top candidates were and cover only them. Somehow we got to the Supreme Court in this case very quickly, and again, I don't remember all of the details of that. The counsel to our campaign was a fellow named Ted Bozanellis, who is now the assignment judge of Morris County. My brother was my campaign manager, Ed McGlynn, named for the Edward R., our great, so-called great uncle. And Art Vanderbilt, who was the grandson of the Chief Justice Vanderbilt, was the head of the campaign for governor. We all talked together and said, let's bring a lawsuit. I can remember saying to my brother on the phone, they're now going to have to come and play in my arena, because it was frustrating as a lawyer. I think I was the only lawyer in that campaign. Bo may have gone to law school, but he didn't practice. And just again, as another aside, Tom Kean used to go around and at these forums would say, I intend to be New Jersey's first non-lawyer governor. And people would applaud. He did that when he was campaigning as well for the general. And that was a frustration for me, of course, being a lawyer, but a sign of how the legal profession had gone down so much in the eyes of the public. But I decided to bring this lawsuit. We got before the Supreme Court. Ted Bozanellis argued the case. And as I remember, we won. That is, the court ruled in our favor. And I remember being interviewed by Sandra King about this and hoping that this was going to give my candidacy some power and strength. It didn't, but that's another story. But then, interestingly enough, after the campaign was over, NJ Public Television sought and got re-argument of the case before the Supreme Court, and they reversed the decision and said that public TV, NJ Public Television, was cloaked with all of the First Amendment rights that adhere to any other journalistic entity, even though they were virtually completely funded by the public. So the decision, we won when it was important to win, I thought, and then lost eventually afterwards. So if you go into the law books, there are 2 written opinions in that case, as I recall. And Chief Justice Willents, I think, wrote the second one. I don't remember who wrote the first one.
That's pretty unusual that a court would go back and amend its finding a year later.
It wasn't a year, it was less than that, Michael, but it is unusual, and I still don't know the dynamics of all of that. I do know that Floyd Abrams was hired by public television to represent them, and the case moved very quickly at the outset and got before the Supreme Court. And I think there was a sense at the court level that, how is this possible that a publicly funded entity is going to narrow its coverage of something as important as a governmental race?
We are still fighting those battles and those issues at NJN today.
I'm not surprised. And it's a wonderful legal issue. That is a fascinating legal issue, that government would create an entity that would then say, even though we're funded by the government, we have to be independent. We have to be outside of the sphere of influence. National public television and radio, particularly radio, has been in this battle for a long time. And I think ultimately, I don't know where I come down on this. I'm still too much personally involved, I guess.
Other than Kane, did you approach any of the other candidates to try to win their support?
Late in the campaign, Barry Parker and Jack Rafferty and I had a confab to say, look, we're all going to lose, so why don't we all get together and the 2 of us will endorse the 3rd and pool our strength. And everybody thought that was a good idea, but we couldn't decide who the 3rd person was. So that was, as I remember, that was the only time we tried to get together and change the outcome. It's a fascinating race in that, first off, the open primary helped Tom Kane tremendously. I would go around to meet with the business community because I had strong ties to the business community as a result of my Public Utility Commission service, and met with Paul Stillman, for example, who's a wonderful man who ran First National State Bank, that's right, and was also very instrumental in the mutual benefit life insurance company. Stillman was in Kramer's camp. Kramer had done a lot of hard work to woo county chairman and to woo the business community early on as the so-called Republican mayor of Paterson. I still remember when Reagan came to New Jersey, and he came to Paterson to speak. We were in the midst of the campaign, the primary campaign, and somebody, I think it was Ray Donovan, told Reagan that Bo Sullivan was a good candidate for governor. And Reagan got up in the center of Paterson. They had let all the government employees take the day or take the morning off to listen to Reagan speak. Reagan was campaigning for the presidency, gave a great speech, and then at the end said something like, and I'm told that there is a candidate for governor that if you support him is going to really turn New Jersey around and turn it into the Republican ranks. Bo Sullivan. And the crowd in Paterson, it was audible. You could hear this because Kramer was the mayor of Paterson, and of course Kramer was one of these candidates. And I can still remember walking to the luncheon that we had afterward with future President Reagan wearing a brown suit, of all things, in which you're never supposed to campaign in a brown suit.
You or he?
Anybody.
No, but
brown suits.
who was wearing the brown suit?
He was. Reagan was. And Reagan saying, you know, fellas, I really apologize. He said, I was given some bad information and I didn't realize that this was such a hotly contested race, et cetera, et cetera. Kramer's people were livid at all of this. I never did find out who put that bug in Reagan's ear. I think it was Ray Donovan. We got along incredibly well. And I know this was mentioned, that Tom Kane mentioned this, that we had a good group of people. And other than somewhat outliers like Imperiali, and Jim Woolwork was a guy who was tough to deal with. Jim was a very rigid guy, strong senator from Essex County. In fact, when I was on the PUC, Woolwork had made some public comment criticizing the PUC. And at a public meeting of the PUC, I took Woolwork to task for that. And Woolwork's memory was rather long. When I left the PUC, it's normal for the legislature to issue a proclamation or commendation or whatever it was. Woolwork wouldn't sponsor it. They had to get Garrett Hagedorn to sponsor it. So he and I were not terribly close. And then at the campaign's end, after Tom had won, we gathered together at Pat Kramer's house afterward for a barbecue. And it was then that I started doing the Byrne impersonations. And they called on all of us to say a few words, and I said, I'm going to speak to you as the existing governor of New Jersey and tell you that the Republican Party has gotten together and they had a choice of great candidates. Barry Parker, great strength in the South. Jack Rafferty, charming. Jim Woolwork, rigid, military bearing. Pat Kramer, Republican Mayor of Paterson. Rich McGlynn, former judge. Bo Sullivan, successful businessman. And Tom Kane. They had all of these candidates. And they wound up with Tom Kane. And it was a great happy time. It was a great happy time.
Had the open primary law not happened, who would have gotten the Essex line?
I don't know. The Essex chairman was John Renna, and he was fairly close to Tom Kane. And I think he probably would have given Kane the line in Essex County. But I'm not sure of that because Woolwork was also an Essex County Republican. I mean, Woolwork was from Short Hills, Kane was from Livingston, I was from Short Hills. So we had three Short Hills, that area, candidates. They both had strong political bases. Tom Kane had spent a lot of time before that primary reaching out and keeping his ties open with the political leadership in the Republican Party. Even though a number of county chairmen had indicated they were going to go for Kramer, I don't know what John Renna would have done. I know he wouldn't have given me the line, Michael, let's put it that way. But it would have either been, I think it would have been Kane or Kramer. But John Ganamort in Bergen County, who was the county chairman up there, I think was in Kramer's camp. And there were a number of other county chairmen who were.
Do you think Kane would have won the primary without
the open primary?
The open primary.
I don't know. I don't know. Certainly it would have made it much more difficult for him.
Kramer had a lot of organization support.
And of course, Bo Sullivan, this was the first publicly financed campaign. And in order to accept public financing, we had to limit our own spending on the election. So we couldn't put our own money, other than to the same extent, $800, into our own campaigns. Bo rejected public funding and spent something like $2 million on the primary campaign. He bought himself third place and bought himself the Republican Party chairmanship when Tom Kane was elected, and eventually became chairman of the New Jersey Turnpike Authority, and became a real power in the Republican Party. But Bo really wanted to be the governor.
Did you debate the eight of you?
Yes.
How many times do you recall?
any number of times. Virtually every county would hold a candidates forum, and we'd all get invited. I can still remember Morris County, they did it at the Jefferson Inn, and it was one of these dinners that started at 8 o'clock, and the dinner went on and on and on, and by about close to midnight, they finally got the candidates up to speak, and I can still remember Jack Rafferty getting up and saying, "Well, good morning, everybody."
How was Kane as a debater?
He was he had become a much more effective speaker. We used to talk among ourselves about one another, and we even talked to one another, obviously, about the campaign. And Tom said that he had taken public speaking lessons in New York from a woman, and that the woman's primary advice was that he should slow up, that is, sort of slow down in the way in which he spoke. And I think that helped him tremendously, because I think his mind always worked faster than his mouth, and that caused him to have what I think people perceived of, and he may even have actually had a bit of a stutter or a stammer. And by the time he'd gotten into the '81 campaign, he had pretty much lost that. But I just didn't think he could get elected.
Why not?
Because I thought he came across as being too aristocratic, being too unlike the sort of regular guy that or person that you want in a governorship. I do remember that Bo Sullivan during that campaign went public and said, "I just can't see Tom Kane as the kind of a guy you'd want to sit down and have a beer with in Bayonne." And in a nutshell, that crystallized my view of Tom's, what I thought was not going to sell in a general election.
Didn't Kane then go to Bayonne?
He did. He went to Bayonne and had a beer in Bayonne. I think with Bo, as a matter of fact. Yes,
after the
comment. No, and maybe it was after the primary. I don't remember.
When you think back about that primary, did you enjoy it?
Oh, yes and no. It was thrilling. We had a good staff, but we were underfunded. So I enjoyed going out and meeting a lot of people. I enjoyed speaking. I enjoyed talking about issues. I can still remember at the League of Women Voters gathering we did somewhere where we were all mic'd up. We each of us got to make an opening statement, and I was late in the order. Again, I think it was chosen at random. And I remember saying, "Welcome to still another session of the Ronald Reagan Sound-alike contest." And I really felt Reagan had done such an effective job communicating his commitment to fiscal responsibility. And that's what all of us were talking about. The death penalty was a big issue. So, when it was fun, but I can still remember being down in Asbury Park at a gathering of senior citizens and saying to them, I am very much in favor of the restoration of the death penalty. I think we need it as a deterrent. We need it particularly for those few crimes where people simply ignore the value of human life. So when I'm governor, we're going to put the electric chair back in the state's prison. And this crowd erupted with this applause. And I thought, my God, what an incredibly powerful thing this is, to be running for this office and to have the ability to say something like this and have people respond in that gut-wrenching way. And I was awed by that to some extent, I must tell you. So I learned a lot about myself in this campaign.
What did you learn about yourself?
That I'm probably not cut out for politics. That my skills are elsewhere, probably more at the law, more at being a facilitator, more at being someone to bring people together than someone to forcefully advocate one side of a point. Even though I loved prosecuting, I loved defending. but I learned that I'm probably better at being an accommodator rather than a confronter.
Did you work for Kane after he won the primary?
I did. We were not called upon to do a lot. We all endorsed, but yes, I did work. In fact, I worked on the legal aspects of the Ballot Security Task Force, which is not much remembered these days. Very controversial, sending campaign operatives into the inner cities with posters, Ballot Security Task Force, if you're not properly registered to vote, you may be committing a crime or something like that. And that resulted in a big lawsuit before Judge Debevoise in the federal court after the primary was over, which also resulted in some rules as to whether that's the appropriate thing to do.
Democrats said it was racist.
They did. They did say it was racist.
What's your view?
Certainly was, by being directed at the inner cities, it was not racist in its intent, but racist in its effect. It was not intended, in my judgment at least, as something that was meant to be anti-black or anti-African American. But I think it had that effect and was perceived of as having that effect. And better it should not be done. Or if it's going to be done, that it be done by a governmental agency rather than a campaign.
We're going to try to bring this to a close.
Good.
Was Tom Kean a good governor?
Yes, he was. He was a very good governor. Tom Kean has incredible political skills, and he is able to read people and to read political situations incredibly astutely. I think he was a very good governor. He was a very popular governor because he knew how to be effective in presenting New Jersey as a place that business would be welcome, that people in New Jersey could be proud of and should be proud of. And I think he did that very effectively. Effective education governor, the statute allowing the state to supersede in troubled school districts, I think was done, as I remember, was done under his governorship. And that was a very effective and responsible thing to do. I remember they talked about the 3 E's of education, economy, and environment. And Tom had a great record in the environment. He established the DEP as a legislator and was a strong advocate for sound environmental regulation and laws in the state. So yes, I think he was a very good governor. He also hired my brother to be his chief of staff, and my brother had been my campaign manager during the campaign. So it was somewhat ironic that my brother became his chief of staff and I went about my life handling public utility law.
How did your brother become his chief of staff?
Good question. My brother was, I think Erwin Kimmelman was AG early on in the Kean administration, and Erwin hired my brother to be a deputy AG. And my brother has wonderful political skills. And somehow that came to Tom's attention. You're going to have to ask my brother this, Michael, because I'm really not sure of the details. But ultimately, when Greg Stevens left as Tom's chief of staff, Ed was asked to go in and take that position. So it was somewhat bittersweet.
Were you proud?
Of course. But, you know, there is a sense that says, hey, I would have liked to have had that job and would have made you chief of staff, or would have made you, my brother's a very able guy. So he would have had a role certainly to play in the McGlynn administration had it happened. But instead he worked for Governor Kean. I remember coming to Trenton with Tom one morning to ask whether I could have a job in the Kean administration. And I sat in his office. I called his secretary. I said, how do I get to spend some time with him? She said, well, why don't you call, you live near where he is. Why don't you see whether you can get get in the car with the trooper in the morning and come to Trenton with him, and then you can take the train back home and get yourself whatever, blah, blah, blah. So I did that. And when I got to Trenton, sat in his office, and I said, there's only one thing I'd like, Governor, and now I'm very happy doing what I'm doing. I think I'm okay. I have no problems with practicing law. I've done that for a long time. But there's a bi-state waterfront commission that was set up to prevent organized crime from getting involved in the docks in New York and New Jersey. 2 commissioners. It's a part-time but paid position. And I said, I'd really like to be the head of the, or not the head, I'd like to be a commissioner, the New Jersey commissioner, New York commissioner and New Jersey commissioner. I'd like to be the New Jersey commissioner. He said, I think you're overqualified for that job. That ended that.
Who did get that appointment, do you recall?
I think it was Conrad Koch. Connie Koch was the head of the Lawyers for Kane, and an Essex County lawyer, and a good guy.
Given your histories in your history in the utilities industry, both public sector and now private sector, what's your current perspective on the industry and whether the various rounds of deregulation over the years have been a good thing?
Deregulation has not necessarily been a good thing. I think it's been a good thing in the telecommunications industry because it's resulted in real competition and the driving down of prices and the availability of telecommunications services in a very, very broad way. In the electric utility industry, it resulted in a lot of electric holding companies being formed, and we helped form PSE&Gs and Atlantic Energies. And as a result, investments were made in ventures that were probably not a good idea. The whole business of deregulating electrics is now back on the table again, and there's strong movements for re-regulation across the country. The California experience was an absolute disaster because California, in addition to the problems with the energy trading markets, which were huge, California mandated that the utilities provide service but wouldn't let them get any rate increases. So they had to go out and borrow money, they had to go out and find sources of energy. They couldn't build any new plants. So deregulation in California was a disaster. The company on whose board I now serve has some generating capacity. Its major business is the transmission of electricity. And we'll probably continue, the company will probably continue to own generation, but it's placed in the market in such a way where there is no complete vertical control anymore of the electric industry. And I think the jury's still out on whether that's been a good idea.
Given your interest in the arts, do you have any thoughts on the current controversy over the level of arts spending in the state? Tom Kean has weighed in heavily in favor of more arts spending.
And I think there should be more arts spending. I think Tom Kean's absolutely right. My concern as a board member of the New Jersey Shakespeare Theater for a long time has always been that if the arts become too dependent on government, they run the risk of being deeply disappointed and put at risk when government turns away. So there's got to be some balance in terms of government funding. My concern in New Jersey right now is that there is a demonstrable lessening of charitable contributions in New Jersey as a result of this tax on the most well-to-do people. We have a friend who runs the New Jersey Community Foundation, and he's seen a measurable decrease in the extent to which private individuals in New Jersey support the arts. And that's the result of a tax policy that I think is a huge mistake. We have too many friends who have kept their houses in New Jersey, bought houses in Arizona or Florida or North Carolina, and are now legally residing in those places to avoid the New Jersey income tax, to avoid the New Jersey inheritance tax, which isn't tied to the feds. And they're lawyers, and they decide that the best way to show their residence in these other places is, in addition to insuring their cars, voting there, et cetera, they give to local charities. So their New Jersey giving has decreased. That's not good for the state.
Let's end with a few more words about your uncle, E.R. McGlynn.
Edward R. I saw him try a case late in his career. He represented one of the defendants in the criminal case that arose out of the collapse of the Military Park garage in Newark. They excavated under Military Park, built the parking garage there, and a part of it collapsed, and the allegation was that there was an inadequate whatever the mixture was in the cement that was being made. And E.R. defended a fellow who worked for the cement company that had provided the cement, and this guy had been indicted. He was the guy who, up in the tower, would literally control the mix of whatever the minerals were and the water that went into the cement trucks. Joseph DeRoma was his name. And I still remember being in the courtroom when E.R. talked about Joe DeRoma being up there in his ivory tower just trying to do his job. And here he is now having to respond to a criminal charge. What is there in this? He said, a defendant in a criminal case, I said, I'll never forget this, is clothed in a cloak of innocence. And unless and until that cloak is removed by the prosecution and he is shown to be guilty in all of his nakedness, he's entitled to be found not guilty. It was just beautiful. Great stuff.
I saw a former state senator who could have used a defense like that last week in federal court.
Well, that's another story.
That's
Michael.
another story.
That is a wonderful story in many ways, and New Jersey's got to get its act cleaned up. We're still too much tied into money and politics in this state, and I don't know what the answer is, but others will deal with that.
Rich, thanks for sharing your memories with us.
I've enjoyed it. Thanks, Mike.